A new series, This Is Us. If you don't watch the show, you should be ashamed of yourself. You should watch it. It is fabulous, and really this series has nothing to do with the show. But I thought it fit very nicely. This is us. What are God's goals? What are His purposes for relationships? And today, this morning, we are not forgetting about our singles. Now, I know we're kind of a small group, so I don't want to ask you to raise your hand. I kind of know who you are. But singleness, listen to me now, can be a very difficult season of life. From a young teen who longs to be loved, a young adult longing to be loved, to someone who was once married and is now divorced, who longs to be loved, or a widower who longs to be loved, not to mention the person that God has gifted to be single for their entire life, who also longs to be loved. We get this from the very beginning of creation in Genesis chapter 2, verse 18. God had created a man, but He said, this isn't good for the man to be alone. And most of the men in here could say, amen. Not good for me to be a man who is alone. And God said, I will make a helper who is just right for him. So there we see the foundations for marriage. And Pastor Roddy is going to come next week and talk about God's purpose in marriage. I think it's a little easier to process God's purposes in marriage as we see it through history. I'm sorry, I lost my spot on the page. I know that was a little weird. There wasn't a meant to be. But it's easier to process God's purpose in marriage and see it through history than it is to accept God's purposes in singleness. As a matter of fact, I was talking to Laura. I don't know that I've ever heard a message on singleness. And I certainly have never preached one, so this is brand new for y'all. I was single at one point, and I thought, Lord, I don't have the gift. I do not have the gift, and I was seeking to get married, and I was genuinely blessed to be married when I was relatively young, when I was 25, just 10 years ago. No, actually, we're about to celebrate number 19. But I had a good friend. He was one of the guys that was in my wedding, Samuel Song. Actually, Annie and I, we were all mutual friends. And Samuel, likewise, did not have the gift of singleness. And we joked and halfway lamented when we were in college about, the singleness experience. And God blessed me there, and we got married, and he was in our wedding. And he didn't like that so much, so he would joke. And it was actually many years later, and Samuel was actually a couple years older than me. It was many years later that he got married. So I was single, but I spent more time than I'd like to admit thinking about not being single anymore. But once I discovered God's goal, once I leaned into what is God's purpose for my life during this season, everything changed. So here's a question. Let's start with, what is God's purpose for singleness? Well, is it just a time to let loose? Ain't got no one to answer to? You ain't got to live with nobody? Spread your wings and live for yourself? Or maybe some people think it's a good time for preparation for marriage, for practice for marriage. Practice it out on someone and, see how it goes. And then there's Beyonce's philosophy. I know you got it already up in there. Where my single ladies at? Now, I am not going to try to sing this out loud, but let me just read you some of the lyrics to this song, and let's see, maybe this fits. Maybe or maybe not. This is God's purpose for singleness. Up in the club, just woke up. I'm doing my own little thing. Decided to dip, but now you want to trip because another brother noticed me. I'm up on him, he up on me. Don't pay him any attention. Cried my tears those 3 good years. You can't be mad at me. Verse 2. I got gloss on my lips, a man on my hips, hold me tighter than Darrion jeans, acting up, drinking my cup. I couldn't care less what you think. I need no permission. Did I mention don't pay no attention to him? Because you had your turn, but now you're going to learn what it really feels like to miss me. Come on now, because if you like it, you should have put a ring on it. You know what? Yeah. If you like it, then you should have put a ring on it. Well, now, there is a time to put a ring on it. But, for most. But what does God have to say about singleness and His purpose in that season? And I just want to say, for most, there is a time for marriage. For some, it is a gift of singleness. For some who have maybe been married, been divorced, or widow or widower, then it's then to stay single. For some to be remarried. Thankfully, though, God makes His goal and His purpose clear. crystal clear for singles. So lean in and listen with me. 1 Corinthians 7, that chapter is all about marriage and singleness, so I encourage you to dive into it. We're going to do that in these couple weeks. Apostle Paul says this in verse 25. Now about virgins, so an unmarried woman in particular, I have no command from the Lord, but I give a judgment as one who by the Lord's mercy is trustworthy. Now, from this, Jesus, and if you look at Jesus' life and his words, he never directly said anything really about singleness, nor did he give the Apostle Paul any clear instructions. But Paul was a man of integrity, as he said here, and godly leadership who himself was single. So don't think less of what Paul is about to say just because he says, well, I didn't have a clear command from the Lord. He's still aware that he's writing Scripture. He's aware of that. But for our singles and for all of us to relate to singles, all of us who relate to singles in one way or another, let's lean in and hear what God has to say through Paul, an apostle who spoke on behalf of God. There are three clear advantages for being single. Let's talk about the three advantages of singleness. Check it out. The first advantage to being single life is easier in crisis. Single life is easier in crisis. Listen to what he says here, verse 26. Because of the present crisis, I think that it is good for a man to remain as he is. Are you pledged to a woman? Don't seek to be released. Are you free from such a commitment? Don't look for a wife. But if you do marry, listen now. Listen, y'all single folks. Listen up real clear. This is the Bible. If you do marry, you have not sinned. And if a virgin marries, she has not sinned. But those who marry will face many troubles in this life. And I want to spare you from this. I didn't make it up. That's not the Southern version. That's not the Ed paraphrase. That is the Word of God. Now, what is this present crisis that Paul talks about? I don't think he's talking about just hardships in general, but times of crisis, which the Corinthians were certainly facing. And throughout generation after generation, there's typically a crisis for Christianity. The church faces various crises, major crises throughout history. So it's not clear what it is. Was it a famine or financial, Roman tyranny? There was overthrow of Jerusalem in AD 70. This is a decade or so before that. So leading up to that major crisis, maybe Paul was talking about the fact that the church was going to enter into a tremendous time of persecution. But I think, again, it's Paul's way of saying there's a crisis in every generation as we wait for the main next thing, which is Jesus coming back. Notice what he says here in 2 Timothy 3, 1 through 5. I think this is kind of what Paul was talking about. And as I read this, think about how this may relate to crisis. You should know this, Timothy, that in the last days, there will be difficult times, very difficult times, for people will love only themselves and their money. They will be boastful and proud, scoffing at God, disobedient to their parents, and ungrateful. They will consider nothing sacred. They will be unloving and unforgiving. They will slander others and have no self-control. They will be cruel and hate what is good. They will betray their friends, be reckless, be puffed up with pride, and love pleasure rather than God. They will act religious, but they will reject the power that could make them godly. Stay away from people like that. Kind of sounds like, life in your neighborhood, probably, right? I was picking up Elijah from school the other day, and I shouldn't be surprised whatsoever. I'm always grateful when I get to go in the school because you learn something about culture if you go into a middle school or high school. And I walked in, and I'm just following these two random kids. I'm not trying to eavesdrop on their conversation or anything. And man, they're just cursing it up and all this kind of thing. And I'm just like, this is a difficult time. Like if you're a Christian, if you're living for Jesus, walking into that, that's a little bit difficult to hear and engage with. In fact, when Adam and Eve were leaving the garden, the perfect place where God dwelt, there must have been a sense of transition. I don't know what the conversation would have been, but it's been happening ever since, and it will continue until Jesus comes back. I mean, just imagine what Adam and Eve are saying as they're leaving perfection. Whose fault? Yeah, maybe they're bickering back and forth, or maybe they're hoping they get to go back, or maybe the grass is greener over there. Who knows? I don't know what their conversation would have been, but certainly there was a transition. And in times of crisis, Paul says, single life has an advantage. You can adapt. You can be more flexible. You can pick up and move if necessary. You can kind of do what you want. I mean, not what you want, but what God wants, and you ain't got nobody to be accountable to except Him. Now, please hear me, though. Paul is simply listing the advantages. He's not putting down marriage. He's lifting up singleness as an honorable way of life, especially in a culture where it may be looked down upon. Those who choose to remain single or have it as a long-term gift are not second-class people. They don't have a secondary class in the church. Paul's lifting them up. But remember verse 28, singles. But those who marry will face many troubles in this life. I know you're elbowing. I know you're thinking, he's talking about you. And Paul said, I want to spare you of this. Married folks face a lot of trouble in this life, don't we? I mean, it's glorious. But there's conflict. There's in-laws. There's trouble in the bedroom. Whoop! There's challenges with children. There's more responsibility. There's financial burdens. There's living with someone in close quarters can itself be troublesome. We could go on and on. It's not easy. And Paul would like to spare some of you singles from such an experience, at least right now. If you're single, you are spared from them. Now, singles, recognize the first advantage of being single. It's much easier to be single in crisis. Not alone, but single. Notice the second advantage. Advantage number 2, single life makes prioritizing easier. Yeah, there we go. Come on. Now, listen to what Paul says here, verse 29. What I mean, brothers and sisters, is that time is short. And I think brevity of life. Life is short. It's so fragile. It comes and goes so quickly. From now on, those who have wives should live as if they do not. Those who mourn as if they did not. Those who are happy as if they were not. Those who buy something as if it was not theirs to keep. Well, imagine how different life would be if we lived like that. Those who use the things of the world as if not engrossed in them. For this world and its present form is passing away. Friends, the Christian biblical worldview is radically different than the world's. The world wants to feed us these messages of things that we need, experiences that we need, more of whatever that we need to be happy. But we do not have forever on earth. It is truly not the one who has the most toys and the most pleasures before they die wins. That is not true. The one who has the nice house and the great job and lots of money, those things don't satisfy. Those temporary pleasures are just that. They're just temporary. There's a greater purpose. There's a greater goal for all Christians, whether married or single. Now, back in the day, and I mean way back in the day, like 1800 BC or so, the time of the patriarchs, people lived hundreds of years back then. Imagine your perspective on life if you legitimately knew you were going to make it to 500. You could be a little more leisurely about life. And when you got a few more 100 years to go, you might be a little slower with certain things. I got time. I can wait for another one. But then David, around 1000 BC, said, well, we get about 70 years, maybe 80 or so if we're really blessed, if we're really lucky. Life is short. Discovering God's purpose for our life, His goals for our life, whether we're single or married, is paramount to living a truly fulfilled, joy-filled life. Paul's response to the brevity of life and to the pull of the world is to resist just making a living. Resist making, instead of trying to make a living, it's making a life that is counting for eternal priorities. That's what he meant when he said, let those who have wives live as if they do not. He was not saying neglect your wife. neglect your responsibility. No, of course, Paul says, love your wife as Christ loved the church. And we're going to talk about that next week. He's certainly not saying to shirk your responsibilities to your children or your home, and we're going to get that again next week. But he was calling us to keep our priorities in line. And when we're single, it's easier to keep our priorities in line. It's a little harder when those, in our case, for me personally, when there's 5 other voices at home that I got to go, I got to attend to. If there ain't nobody else at home, it's just easier. It doesn't mean it's easy. It's just easier. Now, married folks, don't let maintaining your home be the major reason for your existence. Is it important? Yes. It is not. There is no marriage in heaven. There's no husband or wife in heaven. I mean, clearly Jesus talked about that. Don't give all your time to enjoying this present life. There are higher demands and higher challenges to focus on. Marriage is only for this life and not for eternity. Again, there's a tension here that we're going to always live with. Yes, my wife is my number one earthly priority. I am to love her sacrificially, to give, primary time to my children, especially as they're young. But in the context of a greater purpose. Even God-given marriage, which is beautiful, is not the number one priority. That's really the point of this whole passage. Remember what the Apostle John said, that John was one of Jesus' closest friends, was there in the most pivotal moments of his life and death. Listen to what John said in 1 John. He wrote this little letter, a few verses in chapter 2. He said, "Do not love this world, nor the things of the world, nor the things that it offers. For when you love the world, you do not have the Father, You do not have the love of the Father in you. For the world offers only a craving for physical pleasure, a craving for everything that we see, and our pride and our achievements and possessions. These are not from the Father, but are from the world. And this world is fading away along with everything that people crave. But anyone who does what pleases God will live forever." I mean, so if we learn what pleases God in singleness, what pleases God in marriage, what pleases God in parenting, that's what this just short 3-part series is about, then we are in line with God's purpose for our very life. And then, I mean, I kind of want to say it's fun, it's happy, but it's joy-filled. It's not easy, but it can be joy-filled. So, my single friends, recognize the second advantage to being single. It makes prioritizing much easier. Now, the third and final advantage to being single, and this is really everything and number one. Single life makes devotion to God easier. Listen to this. This is the crux of the whole chapter. Verse 32, "I would like you to be free from concern. An unmarried man is concerned only about the Lord's affairs, how he can please the Lord. But a married man is concerned about the affairs of this world, how he can please his wife. And he should be, by the way. And his interests are divided. An unmarried woman or a virgin is concerned about the Lord's affairs. Her aim is to be devoted to the Lord in both body and spirit. But a married woman is concerned about the affairs of this world, how she can please her husband." Now you see what Paul did just there. It's equal in his eyes there, right? Did you see? It's not the woman subservient to the man, but the man serves his wife, the wife serves her husband. Both are concerned about each other, as they should be. But that takes our attention off of other things, doesn't it? Verse 35, here it is. "I am saying this for your own good, not to restrict you." You're not going to miss out. "But that you may live in a right way, in undivided devotion to the Lord." When I came across this when I was in college, it was a big part of my motivation to make a 2-year commitment not to date, so that during this single phase of my life, a real pivotal shaping time of my life, that I wouldn't, it's not that I didn't want to be married. I already told you in the back of my mind, I thought about how I wanted to be married. I at least wanted to date. I at least want to hold somebody's hand. I at least want to be loved. I want someone to like me. Yes, I struggled with that, but I made this commitment, and that was just my commitment. I'm not saying that's right, that's what everyone should do or anything like that. But I was trying to learn, what does this season of my life look like if I give myself fully to be devoted to the Lord and serving Him? And for me, it was 2 years. For some, it may be 10 or 15 or a whole life. I don't know. Paul's not saying there's anything wrong with a husband trying to please his wife or a wife trying to please her husband. That is part of God's goal and purpose in marriage. Rather, singleness in general and those with the gift of celibacy or singleness specifically are free from those concerns. And they can live a life fully, undivided devotion to the Lord. What a beautiful phrase. Undivided devotion. It makes me think of what Paul says later. He says, I'm afraid that our real enemy, Satan, has deceived you from the simplicity of devotion to Christ, like he deceived Eve. Just that this is what God says, this is what I'm going to do. I know several people who have the gift of singleness, who have chosen a life of singleness to serve the Lord with complete devotion. This is not for everyone, by the way. If you're single, I'm not saying this is for you. It was definitely not for me, and I knew that. But it is a gift to the church. A friend of mine, dear friend of mine, J.R. Woodward, Rod and I know him fairly well. We spent some time with him. He was my first church planting mentor. He leads V3, which is a church planting network out of the BGAV. It's the BGAV that we're trying to get this matching grant from for our internship. He has the gift of singleness. He's able to give himself 100% to the Lord's work, mentoring, teaching, and sharing the gospel. That's what he does with his whole life. And Rod and I know him, personally. I mean, he's not ugly. He's not like super awkward, like he couldn't get a wife. God called him and gave him that gift. There was another guy that was part of a mutual organization that Rod and I know as well. Same thing. Really good-looking, sharp guy. I was baffled when he told me he made a covenant of celibacy. Wow. And maybe for both of them it's just a time. I don't know. Maybe it's their whole life. I don't know. Maybe you've heard of C.S. Lewis. I didn't know a whole lot of his background, but I just learned he didn't get married until he was in his 60s. All that time of his life he was given to think and process and write and give himself fully to the Lord's work. Maybe you've heard of John R.W. Stott, great English preacher and theologian. He is famously known for spending hours every morning in prayer and in Bible study, which produced much fruit around the world through his preaching and through his writing. There's a woman you may never have heard of, Margaret Clarkson. She was a prolific hymn writer. She's from Canada, eh? She taught 38 years in elementary school in Ontario, published 17 books in 7 languages because she was fully able to devote her entire life to that in singleness. Or how about the Apostle Paul, who remained, as far as we know, single. He could travel widely, suffer greatly without burdening a wife. He was able to invest 100% of his time to the Lord's work. And of course, Jesus, who is singularly focused on accomplishing the will of God and the work that the Father had sent him to do, free from all potential distractions that a family would have been. And now, of course, because of that, we all enter into his family, and we are all co-heirs with Jesus, brothers and sisters in his family. Now, instead of the YBH this morning, and if you're new, the YBH is the yes but how, this morning we're going to ask this question. So what? Okay. So what? Well, first, there are times of crisis during our brief stay here on earth. Lives move quickly, right? Life moves quickly, and it departs from us in a hurry. And I was looking in the mirror this morning, and this doesn't necessarily mean, my life is coming closer to an end. But I was looking in a mirror and thinking, man, I have less hair today. I don't know what happened. It was just like, I had long hair. If you're at our dessert tonight, maybe I'll show you the picture of me being baptized. I mean, I had nice, long, blonde hair. And I was just thinking this morning about how, no, it was yesterday because we stayed at a hotel. We were up in Pennsylvania for a wedding. And there's conditioner. I don't know what that stuff is for anymore. But I used to, I'd wash my hair and I would use conditioner. And I remember that was like amazing. And I ain't got nothing, man. It's a struggle these days. Now, thank you. Now, whether you're married or single, both are gifts from God. Whether you're married or single, therefore may our lives reflect His goal and His purpose. That's the overarching theme of these couple of weeks. Now, if you are single, I want to let you know that at least I'm trying to empathize with the fact that I know that it is difficult and we are not just trying to say this is easy. Whether you are young or more mature, there's a lot of pressure, isn't there? There are times when it's lonely and it feels isolating and you long for companionship, whether you're young or more mature. That's why the church is so important. That's why I think when we think about Jesus being single and singularly focused so that all people could come into His family and have a family experience. This new, where we are brothers and sisters. Last night, the wedding that I did yesterday, was the youngest of 4 siblings. The father of the bride is actually the assistant principal at Seneca Valley. It's really cool, kind of some mutual things. The sister-in-law of the bride is the twin sister, total coincidence, twin sister of another woman that I married about 2 years ago. Really interesting. Peruvian influence. There's a Peruvian restaurant downtown Rockville called La Canela. Highly recommend it. So she married into the family that runs that restaurant. And so we went there for our anniversary last year. It's really great. And just mention, hey, we go to Pastor Ed's church. We're part of Pastor Ed's church that married somebody here, and they'll treat you right. Fantastic. And anyway, so during dinner we're talking, and we sat with the mom and the dad, and we were talking about church and the benefits of church, and we were just talking. The point of the story that I'm trying to share is how God will go to great lengths to connect you with the right people. Great lengths. As a matter of fact, he was sharing about how one of his daughters met her husband on a family vacation at the Grand Canyon. And it just so happens that his family, they were getting ready to leave, but for some reason, someone was running late, so they got on the next bus. And it would just so happen that on that bus, there was one seat left. So his daughter sat in the very last seat next to this gentleman, who years later would become her husband. And the story is just on and on and on. And then they tell the story of another daughter. Same kind of thing. And then, wow, God will go to great length. You do not have to go to great lengths. Amen. God will go to great lengths on your behalf. You stay committed to God's goal and His purpose for your life, and He'll put you in the bus right next to the person, or He'll put you in line right next to the person, or He'll use your efforts to find somebody through some online dating or whatever. I'm not against any of those things. But I want you to know that I recognize it's not easy. And that's where the church is so important. So together, let's seek God's purpose and goals for whatever stage of your season you're in. Secondly, my single friends, this is a precious time of life for you. Make the most of this season, whether it's short-term or long-term. Give yourself wholly to the Lord. Commit yourself to authentic community. You are a very important piece to the puzzle. What you bring is important. I think when we were brainstorming and praying and thinking about what kind of church God, I don't think we envisioned that we would have this group of singles in our church, or this kind of group of people. And so we're trying to lean in and listen and hear. Okay, wow, what are you saying? How do we adjust to this? How do we care for these? Well, there's a lot of other single folks in our community who are disconnected, who God wants us to connect with. You bring a lot to the puzzle that married folks don't have, especially discretionary time. Now, not all, but most. Not all, but most. Not all, but most have more than families have. Not all, but most. So discover the ministry, the specific ministry that God has shaped you to serve in the church. Discover that and serve as much as you can. With that, discover the mission that God has shaped you for outside of the church, where He is calling you to serve others, maybe in ways that you wouldn't be able to serve if you were married. To share the gospel, to care for those in need, to fight for justice, to give yourself to undivided devotion. By the way, just a quick side note, I'm very excited. Please pray for me about what God is calling us to here in the school. There's already wheels in motion to potentially, for us to spearhead, to kind of lead and facilitate a food pantry here. The principal's already on board. The mayor of Gaithersburg is already on board, and one of the city council board members is already on board. They're waiting for us to kind of take the next step. There's a church within our network who, again, God will go through great lengths to get you where he wants you to. Laura and I just happened to be in a meeting a few weeks ago where a lady said, oh, there's a church that's in our network that's doing that in this other middle school. Let me connect you with them. So we're in the process of meeting them first, figure out what are they doing, how are they doing it, and how can we do it here? I have a feeling, it's not just a feeling, but a pretty good hunch that there are local funds, there are federal funds, there are people in this neighborhood who care about vulnerable children who don't have enough to eat. How easy of a win do you think that is? How many of you do you think you'd bring some extra food, you'd sacrifice a little bit, you'd give a little bit of extra funding so that there are kids who come in, they really don't have enough to eat, and we can help provide that for them and send them home on the weekends like we've been doing and have done in the past with Manna, Smart Sacks, but do it ourselves here. And it's not something we can do. We're not a super resource church, but we have partnerships. We got people in the neighborhood. We're already partnered. I mean, we already have thumbs up from the mayor and county council member and the principal here. I think God's trying to say something to us. Now, we got some married folks that care a lot about that and you'll give a lot of time, but maybe some of our single folks can really dive into something like this. So here you go. The 3 advantages of single life. I just have Beyonce's song stuck in I can't get it out of my head. Single life is easier in crisis. It's not easy, but it's easier. Single life makes prioritizing not easy, but it makes it easier if I just have to prioritize and the effects are just mine. And third, single life makes devotion to God not easy, but easier. This is God's core goal for singles. So let's take a few minutes and just quiet our minds and our hearts and respond to what the Lord is saying to us this morning. So singles, in these moments, would you just take a moment, even the sacred moment of a service like this, to just commit your singleness to the Lord? Maybe you've already done that. Maybe just in this moment, just say, God, this season, however long it is yours to use. Whether you're a young student, whether you're a young adult, if you're divorced, if you're widowed, whatever season of your single life you're in, dedicate it to undivided devotion to Jesus. Make him your highest priority and your greatest affection. And let him know if that is your desire this morning. And for our married folks, just take a moment right now in this moment to commit or recommit your marriage to honoring Jesus. We'll talk more about it next week. To keep his goals and priorities in view. And by God's grace, to reflect Jesus in all we do as a family. Keep your hearts and minds open to what God wants to say next week. Lean into God's presence in these moments. Listen to the words of the song that we're going to sing. Worship with all of your heart and respond as God leads you.